Hello. Over the last, or actually it was a while ago now, I probably finished reading this about 2 weeks ago. This is the autobiography of Graham Coxon, the guitarist of Blur, in Blur, the Blur guitarist. It's called Verse, Chorus, Monster. And it was released in 2022, I believe, from looking before. It's a library book, because I don't generally buy books because they're bloody expensive in New Zealand. I guess the odd one I'll buy, but I used to, 2022. I used to buy a lot more. And so it's, like a typical biography. It kind of outlines his life in chronological order from childhood through to the present day. And overall, it's pretty good. It's a good read. The fact that I finished it is a good sign because I start a lot of books and don't make my way through them, especially library books, because you get to return them. And I kind of always have an idea in the back of my mind, I'll borrow that again and try to finish it one day. But a lot of them I don't. But this one I got through pretty swiftly. It's an easy read. It's pretty light, I guess, as musician biographies tend to be. So I've always liked Graham Coxon. He was always kind of, I guess, my favorite in Blur because I don't know why. Because Damon seemed like a show-off, and Alex seemed like a show-off, and Dave the drummer was just Dave the drummer. And Graham kind of seemed, I don't know, slightly mysterious and aloof, perhaps. And I always remember people always gave him props. People always kind of bigged him up. Like in the 90s, you know, at the height of the Blur Oasis Britpop battle, I remember Noel Gallagher saying that famous interview where he wished death upon Damon and Alex. He wished a certain viral disease that there is currently no cure for, and but he said, I have a lot of time for Graham, the guitarist. I think he's a great guitarist." He said something positive about him, which at that time was kind of unheard of. And subsequently, I've heard him say other good things about him, like how he thinks he was one of the best guitarists of that generation. And having read this and been listening to a lot of Blur recently, I've listened to a lot of Blur my whole life, but especially recently after reading this, he is quite a unique guitarist. Very original, like in as much as anyone can be original, writing music in the 90s and it's so much had come before, but I never really listened in depth to his guitar parts. But having done that a bit more, and also reading this, it kind of made me appreciate them even more. If there's one thing I'd say that I was a little bit disappointed is that he actually kind of didn't go into a lot of depth when talking about Blur, particularly, I guess the formation and the kind of early period when they were touring America very early on, he kind of went into detail. But especially the Great Escape self-titled era, he kind of really glossed over. And that was what I was particularly interested in hearing about, because the self-titled album in particular is my favorite Blur album and one of my favorite albums of any band, full stop. And I was always kind of interested to know how much different members contributed to the songs. Like from what he said, Damon sounds like the main songwriter. Like he talked about Damon bringing songs to the band. But then saying that other parts, it sounds like he, the guitar, he would put his own spin on it. And then the other songs that he wrote himself. But didn't, really go into... I guess personally, when I the kind of musical biographies or music books that I like are more in depth in the studio side of things, explaining how things were written or the production process, whereas he really doesn't do that for Blur. The latter part of the book, where after he leaves Blur, the hiatus years, he does go into more detail about his solo work. But if I'm honest, I don't really have much interest. It's not that I don't like it. It's just I like Blur a lot more. Again, having read this, I went back and listened through to a lot of his solo stuff. And there's a lot of good stuff there. But I guess it's I'm not going to say tainted or clouded, because that's too negative. His voice is quite one-dimensional. And he admits that. It's quite a kind of reedy, like he even describes it as kind of whiny little boy voice. If you think about the songs that he sings lead vocals on Blur, like You're So Great, or Coffee and TV, obviously, both songs that I love. But his vocal is, the reason I think it works in those songs is because it's kind of a contrast or a juxtaposition to Damon's vocals on the other songs, or even in the chorus of Coffee and TV. And sometimes in a band, it's nice to have kind of the differing sounds in the songs, whereas on his solo stuff, it's just him. His very early solo stuff is kind of very lo-fi, and then as the years go on, he kind of develops more. He does some folk albums. There's a couple, like a good 1 or 2 chapters where he goes on and on and on about bloody folk music, British folk music, English folk, and kind of some of the I don't know, the luminary figures in that genre, which I really have no idea about. But he seems to have a lot of love for English folk. But he goes on about that a lot. And he released a couple of albums in that style. He does focus on the song, and I can understand that, because I guess I assume, I've never actually read any, but I assume a few books have been written about Blur over the years. I know there is certainly one, the one that they released on the 10th anniversary, which is about, the year 2000? Or 1999, they released a book, a biography. I think it was like an authorized biography of the band. I never read that. But a lot has been written about Blur, whether that's in a book or in the magazines or by the press in general. Whereas Graham himself, obviously his solo work is a lot less covered. And so I can understand he wants to kind of focus on that more in his own life story. It's understandable. The other part that was interesting was him talking about him outside of the music, his struggles with, I guess, generally self-esteem. And I don't know how you'd boil that down to a more self-perception, or self-perception and self-esteem, those two things, and how that's really, his problems with that have coloured his entire life through childhood until the present day, and he's kind of only just kind of coming out of the shadow of it now, by the sounds of it, in his 50s. And that it sounds like a lot of his time, the heyday of Blur in the 90s, he was quite, I don't know how to really explain it. He couldn't maybe enjoy it as much as he would have wanted to, because of anxiety and, like I said, the way he viewed himself, and then how that kind of rolled itself into alcoholism eventually. He kind of struggled with alcohol basically from his late teens onwards, and he's kind of had periods of sobriety and then falling off the wagon and then back into sobriety, and it's actually quite hard to keep track of whether he was sober at the time of writing. I think he is. But he spent some kind of, quite long periods in rehabilitation facilities. And again, how the alcohol and the reliance on alcohol was connected to how he viewed himself, a kind of self-esteem. Humiliation from when he was a child, that kind of seemed like a thing as well. Some of the things I really related that he talked about, kind of as I was reading it, there would be like a paragraph where he kind of says something very insightful about how he viewed himself and how that caused trouble in living in life. And I thought that's, like I said, really insightful. I want to kind of like to highlight it or come back to it, but I never actually did. And now when I flick back through the book, I think, was that the one he was talking about? Was that the one? I kind of regret not making, kind of focusing on more what he was saying. But, like maybe this one here? No, actually I won't. Otherwise I'll be reading things that aren't pertinent. But yeah, it's, like I said, I kind of related to those parts where he talked about that. But like I said, in hindsight, like again, having read that and then going back and looking at things like videos, like there's one video in particular. Like I remember even when I was a teenager, when I first got into Blur in my teens, 15, 16, around the Great Escape, but particularly the self-titled album. If you ever saw the videos, he always seemed a little bit awkward and like he didn't really want to be there. Or like I said, word again, like aloof. But in that time in the 90s, a certain awkwardness or aloofness was kind of seen as cool. You know, that was the order of the day, to kind of not care about things. I'm in a video here, but I don't really want to be here. I'm a rock star artist, but then reading this, it's more likely actually he really was awkward and aloof, and that's just how he came across, not trying to be cool, but just that's how he is. There's one part in the Boys and Girls video, which is the first video I ever saw of theirs. If you haven't seen it before, it's like the band are playing in front of like a green screen, and like behind them there's images of like holidays and British people holidaying in places like Spain or Greece or warm parts of Europe. And the band you see from time to time performing in front of it. And there's one part very near to the beginning, and Damon's like the exact opposite. Damon, because if you read this, he says Damon was actually training to be an actor at one stage. And when he met Damon as like a 12-year-old when they were at school together. And even back then, Damon was like a natural showman, a show-off. Like, all the girls loved him. A lot of guys wanted to beat him up. Kind of the same as how it was when they were famous. I know Damon rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, didn't he? Like, a lot of people loved him, but a lot of people hated him as well. And there's that scene where the camera comes in close to Damon and he kind of winks at the camera. And then there's this other part where you see Graham for the first time and he's standing next to Damon with his guitar, and he looks just awkward. He's got this like weird, awkward look on his face, like kind of looking down, then looking at the camera and then looking down again, like very relatable, but at the same time, not what you expect from, a rock star. And then the country house video, he absolutely looked like he just was like, I don't want to do this. And apparently he says a number of times he doesn't like that song. He wanted to get away from that song in their career. So yeah, if you're a fan of Blur, or especially if you're a fan of Graham Coxon, but even if you're a fan of Blur, even though I said he does gloss over a lot of the Blur stuff, I would still absolutely recommend it. It's a good book. His childhood is relatively interesting as well. Growing up, he was the like an army kid. Like his dad was in the army, and I think he spent a lot of time in Germany and then in different parts around England. Like they were based in different areas, so he moved around a lot. And his dad was actually in the army band. Like armies have like brass bands, I guess. He had like a high position in the army band. And so he comes from a musical family. But related to that, not when you just talk about a book, because obviously this is a secondhand CD channel, or whatever you want to call it. This is my Blur collection. Blur are kind of one of my favorite bands. I wouldn't say they're the favorite or anything like that, but they are a band that I've liked for a long time, and I like pretty much everything from across their career, to differing degrees, of course. I don't have Leisure, their first album. I don't have Modern Life is Rubbish. I used to have that probably about 20 years ago, but as is the story so many times in these videos, I sold it or lost it or something happened to it. So the first album I have of theirs that chronologically that I own is Park Life, which actually showed recently. I picked this up for $2 and was very happy to find it. This was kind of, I guess, Leisure and Modern Life is Rubbish did find some success in England, maybe not America, but in England. They had singles like There's No Other Way, and was For Tomorrow on Modern Life is Rubbish? I think so, yes. Which are both, pretty good singles. This came out, and this was kind of, I guess, their first step into, without being cliched, the big leagues or into kind of the next higher level of success. Particularly because of track 1 and track 4. Girls and Boys, like I said, that was the first song I ever heard it from them. And Park Life, which is kind of one of their calling card songs, you know. If they were going to feature a story on the TV news, the 6 o'clock news about Blur, and they had like kind of showing a few of their songs quickly, I'd say Park Life would definitely be one of those. It's got the cover of the Greyhound Racing. Do they still have Greyhound Racing in your country? I know that they're talking about banning it here in New Zealand because it's considered quite cruel to, the dogs or the rabbit. I think they used a live rabbit in training, and maybe that's why it's seen as cruel. I'm not sure. I don't really know much, but I've never actually been and watched a greyhound racing or gambled on one. Actually, this is something Graham talked about in his book, because when he was learning guitar, he had to buy the chord books. I guess like kind of like the tablature, but not the tablature, like the tablature, but with chords. Well, so he included the chords on the liner notes with the lyrics, so you'd know if you're learning how to play. So he actually puts the shapes here. E sustained 4, E, B, D, C, B, E, E7, E, E7, G major, sharp. He, as a guitarist, he's quite a, what's the word, unconventional. In saying that, look, that song's pretty conventional. A, E, D, F, G, A, E, D, F, G. It's a pretty straightforward song. But a lot of his, what was the one I was listening to recently? Charmless Man. I was watching a video on YouTube of the isolated guitar of that, just the guitar. So sometimes someone's playing the guitar over the backing track but this was just the guitar only. And it's quite a weird guitar line. Like it's great. I'm not saying it's bad in any way, but it's very unconventional, like very original and unique. Nothing like, as much as they were compared to Oasis or pitted against Oasis is so much more traditional songwriting, straightforward stuff, whereas Blur has got a lot more left field stuff going on, especially as their career went on. Next that I have is Great Escape. I've shown this before, I did a video about it. Great album. I especially like the first half. The CD is meant to be like a rubber ring, like a life preserver type thing. Here's the band. Stereotypes, great song. Charmless Man, speaking of that, great song. Fade Away, I love that song. Thought of Cars. someone just wrote a comment on one of my videos recently about The Great Escape. They were saying the song Yuko and Hiro is about Damon and Justine. Frischman, his girlfriend at the time, the singer and guitarist from Elastica. So they were in a relationship for a part of the 90s, kind of like a celebrity couple. But obviously they were both in successful bands. Elastica were relatively successful. And so they were obviously touring and doing all the other things that are required to be in a band. And so they saw each other very rarely. As you can imagine it in the 90s, you know, where the record industry is still in full swing, there's still money for all the stuff, promotional stuff, and traveling all over the country doing interviews and tours, and then international tours, and then it would be hard enough if you just had a wife or a girlfriend who was at home. So every time you came home, she would be there. But imagine if your girlfriend or wife or partner or whatever, she was in a band, so she was off doing that stuff as well. So it would be like to kind of mesh together the timetables or the schedules would be nigh on impossible. And so that song, Yuko and Hiro, the person who very nicely left a explainer saying that, yeah, it's about how they basically never saw each other, and I guess the problems that would create in a relationship. Next up, my favorite album of theirs, one of my favorite albums ever. An album that's really pivotal. Again, I don't like using these kind of cliched words. Important. It's big. As a teenager, they're kind of like several albums. There's so many albums I love, but kind of I feel like, say if I had to pick 5 albums that seem to have a big impact on me, like Soundgarden, Super Unknown, Nirvana In Utero. Other ones I can't think off the top of my head, but one of them would be Blur. That came out in 97 when I was in 6th form, so about 16. And it just, in my mind, it just seemed like it was like a soundtrack for that part of my life. And subsequently, through the rest of my life, because I still listen to it a lot, regularly. The color scheme, this kind of brownish, tannish, yellowish, brightish, it looks like it's from a hospital or something. I've talked about this before. I did a video about this as well. This is a second-hand copy owned by T. Avery. I've owned this probably 3 times in my life. uh, 14 great songs. Oh, actually, what are the songs I don't like? Look Inside America, I've always kind of been iffy on. Maybe MOR, I'm not the biggest fan, but the rest of them. Beetlebum, an amazing song. Song 2, you know, classic. Country Sad Ballad Man. Graham actually talked about that song quite a bit, saying how he was proud of that, the kind of the woozy off-kilterness of that song. If you've ever heard it before, it kind of seems slightly like, I don't know, like you're drunk or something when you listen to that. The way that it's very loose. You're So Great, which is a song he wrote and sung on. Then we get to this one, which is a Japanese import double CD, which I picked up for $1. This is like a remix, double disc. You can see it's got the Japanese liner notes, which is usually included with Japanese imports, or if you buy things in Japan itself. Japan. Hey, this is good. Look at this. I often talk about how crappy these side hinge double CD holders are, that the back one almost never holds it in. Every time you pick it up, the CD just sits in there because it can't cling on to that. But this one looks like it's got more spokes, or more, whatever you call, on the hub. Anyway, this is like a remix album going through some of the songs and done by different people, such as William Orbit and Moby and John McIntyre, whoever he is. I like the Thurston Moore mix of Essex Dogs Essex Dogs already is quite a kind of strange song, and he makes it, as this is called bustin and dronin, a very kind of drone heavy song, as you might expect from a Sonic Youth member. Then we've got some live sessions from John Peel's radio show throughout the years. Then we get to their best of, which was released, I think, a year after this, 2000. So it's just a non-chronological journey through their career, with Music Is My Radar being the the bonus track thrown in on, as I often do on Greatest Hits, to kind of sell it to people who already own all these songs on their other albums. Alex James uses that picture for the front of his book, his biography, which is something I've never read, but I've ordered it. So in the libraries in Auckland, my city, you can order the book from another library and they'll deliver it to your library. Sometimes it can take quite a long time, but hopefully in the next month or so, I'll get his one to read it. Be interesting to see his perspective, if it's kind of similar to Graham's. It was quite interesting also to see in the book, these guys weren't, at least in the 90s, like they started as friends. Like I said, Graham knew Damon since they were little kids. And they kind of stayed working together, even when Damon moved to London and kind of did separate things for a while. They kind of kept a relationship of doing music together because they could kind of maybe see something in each other. And then Alex joined because Alex was at the same art school as Graham, Goldsmiths. And I can't remember how Dave joined because he was from back in Essex. They knew him somehow. So in some ways they were kind of friendly beforehand, but during the 90s, it didn't seem like they were really friends. They didn't really confide in each other. As difficult as that time would have been for a band, Graham's alcoholism and Damon was, the focus in the press a lot, and a lot was written about him and his relationships. And I said there was a lot of hate towards him as well. And I guess the other guys also had, whatever issues, but it sounded like they didn't confide in each other or support each other in that kind of way, like kind of personal ways. It was just like, and I guess times were different back then, even though the 90s seems so recent. A lot has changed in those last 20 to 30 years, haven't they? Things like with mental health, understanding, men supporting each other. Whereas maybe, and even nowadays still, there's a massive hangover, but, saying to a friend, if you knew your friend was going through a hard time, and you say to him, if you need anything, I will help you, or, trying to be sincere and without being without putting a veneer of masculinity over the top, was very rare. Whereas nowadays, that's a bit more acceptable to kind of say to a friend or a mate or a coworker, I'm here for you if you need any help, if you don't feel like you have to suffer in silence. People are more willing to say that. Maybe that's more younger generations as well. I'm thinking about some of the people I know who still absolutely would not say those things. But after they had their breakup, which I'll talk about in a second, and now they've reformed, they do the odd tour here and there, and they release things from time to time. They seem a lot more comfortable with each other, probably because they're not around, they're not in each other's pockets like they would have been in the 90s. But anyway, next up was 13. This was 1999. So actually this was released before that. Am I right? 99? Yes. And that picture on the front was actually painted by Graham. Because if you read the book, he was, as much as a musician, he was an artist, and he went to art school, and that kind of seemed like the direction of his life for a time before music kind of took off for him. And still today, he still paints and draws a lot. I feel this, if you think about the albums that came before this, you know, you kind of put Leisure and Modern Life is Rubbish and Park Life and Country and Great Escape together, those four, even though there was definitely a sound evolution through those four. I'm not saying they sound all alike at all, but they go together well. You can see the direct connection from album to album. Then jumping from Great Escape to self-titled, I feel there's quite a big jump. And there's a lot more variety and experimentation on self-titled album, which is purposeful. Graham actually wrote a letter to Damon before they wrote that album and saying, I want to do this album differently. He didn't want to just go back and do more stuff like Country House or Park Life. And then from self-titled to this, again, it's quite a big jump. There's comparing this to Park Life, I feel there is a large leap. Whereas if it was Oasis going from Definitely Maybe to Standing on the Shoulders of Giants, which was similar times as Park Life and this, the jump is much, much less evident. Which is fine. I'm not saying that is like the sign of greatness or anything like that at all. It's just I'm trying to illustrate how they, I guess, were different kinds of bands. I got into this album later. I didn't like Tender or No Distance Left to Run when they first came out. Those are the first two singles off this. And I didn't like either of those when they first came out. And so I kind of, not avoided, but just never really got into this album for a long time. And then probably about, I don't know, I listened to it properly for the first time maybe 10 years ago. And then slowly I've come to like it a lot more. I particularly like the song 1992. It's a great song. I like Trailer Park. But yeah, that song 1992, it's like, it's kind of like a perfect bridge from self-titled to this album. Then we get to this one. And this is the Graham-less album, or except for, I think he's on one song. Again, the jump from this to this, I think, is quite large. It seems like as their career continued, the leap from album to album got larger and larger. So kind of like from Leisure to Modern Life is Rubbish is just kind of a little step, and to Park Life is a little step, and then gradually getting bigger, and then from this one to this one, it's like a leap. And part of that is because Graham's not on it. And you've removed the guitar, and the guitar is one of the most identifiable elements of Blur. And this kind of sounds like a Damon solo album. And I don't mean that in a bad way, because I really like this album. And there's some really lovely songs on it. Battery in Your Leg, or Battery in Your Leg, is the song that Graham was involved in. I think all the other ones he didn't take part in at all. It has elements of kind of world music, like I think they recorded part of it in Morocco, so there's kind of North African influences, and you know, Damon was going in that direction at the time, you know, with world music stuff, North African stuff. I think he made Mali music after that. And, you know, Gorillaz had happened before that with the hip hop part, influence. And so kind of all those things that Damon was interested in, you can kind of hear together in this album. Yeah. Now, this is another thing in the book. His departure from the band. He glosses over that as well and makes it sound a lot less acrimonious than I remember it being. Because I remember at the time, they basically, and he kind of does say this. I'm not saying he's lying about it or anything like that, because that would be silly. But at the time, it sounded like in the book, he says he was in rehab, I think for like 6 months. And he was quite raw and vulnerable, as a lot of people are after they leave rehab. And he went from rehab into the studio with the band. And the band had already been in the studio for like 6 weeks before he got there. And he kind of just like, almost like he wasn't feeling it, basically. And so they came to a mutual agreement. He wanted to, and they wanted him to leave for now. Whereas at the time, I remember it being more like he came into the studio and brought such a dark cloud with him and such a bad attitude that the band said, don't come back. We don't want you here. And it was a lot more one-sided. And then afterwards, I remember a bit more back and forth in the media. I remember him taking some shots at Damon and his guitar playing. But yeah, nothing major, but just not exactly how he presents it here. He presents it as kind of, he was happy to leave, he wanted to leave, and it was the most natural thing in the world to have happened. And that, from his perspective, that's true. Who am I to say? Because I'm only talking about as a fucking outsider reading press reports. So that's really, I'm in the worst possible position to be making comment. So anyway, they, after Think Tank, which was 2003, I mean, it was around the Iraq War, which was 2003, 2004. Can't see a date on here. 2003. The band had a break, however, and Damon went and did a million different things. The Good, the Bad, and the Queen, like I said, Mali music, more Gorillaz stuff. He did that Monkey Journey to the West, Chinese opera, lots of other things I'm probably forgetting. Alex went and started a cheese farm or something. Don't know. Or Dave went into politics, or at least tried to get into politics. I think he stood for election for the Labour Party in England. And now he's the member of a council somewhere. And Graham just did a whole bunch of music. He, as much as, I guess, Damon, of course, but him and Damon, he just did a lot of solo stuff from the time he left Blur until the time Blur got back together. He just did solo album of different things. Like I said, he got into folk. He did more kind of punky Buzzcocks type stuff and more post-punk type stuff. But that's kind of what kept them grounded is the music. Then they got back together for some shows, some big shows. I think they played Wembley, and they did the after the Olympics, they did a Hyde Park show, a couple of Hyde Park shows maybe. And then they were in tour in Asia in 2010 sometime. And they got stuck in Hong Kong due to a typhoon, and they had to cancel some shows, I think, in Japan. And they decided to write some music together in a studio in Hong Kong. And the result of that is this album here, Magic Whip, which was released, I think, in 2015. It wasn't all written and done in Hong Kong, but that's kind of where it was laid out. I guess the idea and some of the guitar parts and the melodies and whatnot, and they tidied it up back in England, over the months later. But as much as I was saying that these two albums are kind of like steps away from the 90s Blur sound, this one in particular, this one is kind of a step back towards it, especially with songs like Go Out and I think Lonesome Street. There's no bloody track listing on here. It's all in Chinese because the kind of design aesthetic is, and I don't have my phone, so I can't check the track listing. I think the first song is Lonesome Street. Dan, 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 like a real 90s Blur sounding song. and then Go Out, which is the one that I think it's got quite a big chorus. That's kind of more to the later 90s sound, like kind of the self-titled era. But I think it's a good album. It's kind of like it covers their entire sound of their entire career. It kind of has the more Britpoppy type sound, but it has the more experimental stuff as well. Like on the song "There Are Too Many of Us," it's quite a maybe a more think tank type song. Or "Ong Ong," which is more of a maybe Parklife era song. And they continue touring, and then they've just released last year the Ballad of Darren, I think is what it's called, which I've listened through to once. And again, like Magic Whip, it's quite a short album, kind of sounds like a more with a foot in the 90s Blur sound as opposed to the more experimental stuff. My first listen to it didn't really capture me, but I'm sure if I listened to it more, I would like it. So that is a 40-minute spiel on Blur. The Blur albums I own, which are all secondhand, even though I've owned a few of these new. I own that new, I've owned that new, that new, that new, that one. Oh, I said, actually, sorry, that one is not new. This one's secondhand. Sorry. These ones are all secondhand. This one is new. The other ones I pointed out, the ones that in my life at some point I have owned new. I think I said before that I owned Great Escape on cassette back in about 1996 or 1997. So yeah, a great band. A kind of a band that's always been present in my life since I first started liking them. Because so many bands I kind of go through, I kind of use this band as an example often. Korn, the new metal, if you want to call them new metal, but new metal band. There was a point in my life where I loved Korn. They were like my favorite band. But after my fondness for them waned, it kind of went down to a certain level and stayed there, whereas I can listen to their stuff now, but in very small doses, and some of it I'd say not really my kind of thing. Not to say I don't like them, because there are some songs I do listen to and you think, well, that's still a great song. But Blur, bands that I like Blur, have kind of been at a constant level where I started liking them and I've never dropped below that since. And so that from when I was 16 to now in my early 40s, I appreciate them as much now, if not more. And that's the bands that I can do that with are kind of the ones who I feel they hold like a special place in my heart. Because it's kind of like a rare thing, really, isn't it? Because so many things from your youth don't hold the same, feeling that they once had, or only in a sense of nostalgia, which is kind of like a stale thing at the end of the day. Whereas actually listening to the music and still really like emotionally enjoying it, it's a special thing. Anyway, we'll leave it there. Almost 45 minutes. Sorry. All right, thanks for watching.